So I've got about 15 minutes, I believe, and what I'd like to do is give a quick canter through this place called Canada in terms of the perceived and real impacts of the agenda that we've been talking about since we got here this morning. And again, I'm not sure if I'd be using the right title, call it the OECD Education 2030, call it Global Competencies. I'm not sure what to say we're talking about, but it's something is happening, all right? And so, okay, here we go. There's two questions that I'd like to kind of lay out at the beginning, assuming that I'm not going to get through my slides because of the time issue. I really want to focus on these two questions. Is there such a thing as the program, the agenda? Because it's being experienced across the country anyway, from the contacts that I've made over my 20 years with the Alberta Teachers Association. It's being experienced in very different ways in different provinces and territories. So there's no one thing. And if there is such a thing as the Education Agenda 2030, how would we know it's having impacts? And these are questions that keep researchers up late at night, right? And so this is a big, complicated, gnarly space. And then there's the teacher's question. The light's a little bad. That's a beaver, okay? Why does everyone want to stuff me? One of the projects I'm working on right now at the University of Alberta is we're starting a program on futures thinking and strategic foresight. And we're getting into the conversation around why is it that the private sector has largely occupied the space called futures thinking and this ephemeral thing called futures literacy. I know UNESCO's got a big initiative out on it as well. But what I'd like to put in the front of you today is the possibility that maybe teacher organizations, not only in Canada but globally, need to really question our absence from this space called strategic foresight and futures thinking. Because teachers are really experiencing the future in different ways, multiple futures. We actually worked through a workshop recently with new teachers and asked them a question, variation of Sam's question, the OECD is, and then we asked them the question, my future is, and we got frozen, canceled, and lots of question marks. I won't go through the list. But it does open an interesting space and ask ourselves the question before we get too deep into what is the OECD 2030 program, to really unpack the assumptions about the future we want. What do we mean when we say the future? And I just love this frame, you know. Lots of promises made on behalf of teachers by leaders of their teacher organizations. I know I spent, as I mentioned a moment ago, 20 years in a senior research position at the Alberta Teachers Association. And I used to think, and I still do, having left the ATA last year, that very much what leadership is about is occupying that space of the futures conversation. And I think this is the space we really need to think about as we go through Canada and think about how is the OECD agenda, whatever that is, playing out in different ways, in different respects, around the future, and who gets to name the future, owns the future, as the old line goes. And so this goes back to the fundamental statement at the beginning of the OECD document. Again, a futures orientation, nothing new here, but it's really important, I think, we ground ourselves in the reality of what is the futures imagined by the OECD and its proponents of the Education 23 program, again, whatever that is, and how it's being experienced across the country in classrooms. And this kind of raises the existential question for me as I think about this place called Canada and the role that we as leaders in teacher organizations face, because we're trying to take on this entity called the OECD and Education 2030 as if there is this monolithic understanding and reality around what is the it. What is the it that the OECD is planning on promoting through Education 2030? And as we go through the country, you'll see that there really isn't a good, clear answer to this. But there is still this dynamic at play. And I can recall in my work with ministry officials in Alberta on the very early days of the conversations around the shift to a competency-focused curriculum, that there was very much the sense that the ministry senior bureaucrats had anyway, that there was this future that they had imagined and constructed inside the halls of the ministry that they were then going to promote and engage the profession. And it was extremely problematic from the beginning. Not only when we had a conservative government, because it was very much an owned future, one we heard earlier from Maria, a market model neoliberal agenda, a pre-owned future, to use Andy Hargreaves' sense. But the visioning exercise and the engagement of the profession, was totally absent from the conversation. And right from the beginning, we ran into difficulties, not only when we had a conservative government, when the initial conversations around competency-focused curriculum began, but later on when we had the election of a social democratic government under Rachel Notley. The agenda around a pre-owned future very much continued, and we got ourselves caught into a us, them, and it conversation. So, in practical terms, I don't have a lot of time, and what I thought would be helpful to think about, there's this great article I'd recommend by Berkovich, 2018, using a schema from Matlin. Some of you may have seen this in your research travels. It basically looks at policies and asks the question in terms of mapping the cartography of policy and how they're implemented, that in fact we can't really engage policy unless we understand that quite often the policies have goals and measures that are very distinct. And I think one of the challenges and opportunities in thinking in this kind of matrix as we look across the country quickly here, is that within this matrix we can see that in terms of examples of policies and initiatives like Education 2030 or a shift to global competencies or a competency-focused curriculum, when you have low ambiguity and low tension in the system, you can pretty much do what you want to do, and that's all wonderful. Low ambiguity and high tension, which is quite often the case we see in examples I'll share in a moment, where it's very clear what the government wants to do. There's no questions about the intent, and there's certainly no questions about the measures. And when the two line up and the rubber meets the road in terms of achieving these goals, then it gets, to use the cliche, very political, very quickly, and very contested. And so what I thought we would do here is look at examples in terms of the first quadrant, where you have low ambiguity and low tension. There aren't a lot of examples that I could think of in education, because as the old quote goes, of all of the many-sided things in this world, education has the most sides. We in Alberta anyway, and I look talking to my colleagues across the country, there are examples where the goals are fairly clear and people row the boat together and we get to where we want to go. I'm sure if we went around the room, you could think of lots of other examples in your own working context in the BC space, for example. This has been for what I can see as I go through the examples and contacting teacher leaders across the country, examples of where we'd run into real difficulty with the OECD PISA program, Education 2030, not specifically, but the implications of the PISA program. I think of Nova Scotia last year and how Dr. Avis Glaze wrote a very interesting report that made claims, many of you know what I'm talking about what does PISA tell us about what is working and not working in Nova Scotia. And one of the interesting conclusions based on the data from PISA, which was challenged, as you all know, by other researchers, is that in some respects, Nova Scotia education was a failed state and structural changes needed to be made. The governance of school boards, pulling principals out of the federation, all kinds of very problematic, high-tension, contested decisions were made by the government based on the Glaze report. In Alberta, we have a very interesting discussion, a very problematic discussion around a gap in First Nations students' achievement, measured again by PISA and other standardized assessments. And while there's no question that work needs to be done, the way it's being framed in a deficit model in Alberta as the Aboriginal student achievement gap is creating some real interesting blowback and pushback, okay? And it's not only in Alberta, it's across the country. The next quadrant, terrain 3, high ambiguity and low tension. I see much of the conversation as I talk to folks around the country around the competency-focused curriculum, that generally on its face, people are saying, how could we actually have a real issue with any of this aspirational talk, competencies, all right? And as Joel Westheimer always does when he goes and talks in front of a group of teachers, asks teachers to raise their hand if you're against critical thinking or literacy or numeracy, right? So very much these are, very broad umbrella statements which we try to occupy with our meaning at different levels of the system. But what is interesting, for example, when you look at CMEC, the Council of Ministers of Education, and my communication with the former Minister of Education in Alberta, his very first meeting at the CMEC table was an eye-opening experience for him. First of all, what is a CMEC, and what do you do? And as we heard from Martin this morning and from Sam, you've got these secretariats and these bureaucratic structures that operate in the OECD space, and CMEC is one of them. You've got the representations by the various ministers who have I think the average portfolio shelf life of a Minister of Education in Canada is about 2.5 to 3 years. So there's a turnstile or churn of ministers, but the bureaucracy, the professional bureaucracy is more or less fairly stable. Certainly has been the case in Alberta, as our former government quickly learned. So what happens in these cases, and Ontario is a good example, and I'll talk briefly about New Brunswick as well, that you cannot say, well, OECD, PISA has created situation A, B, or C. But what it has done is created a gestalt, an environment, an ecology, if you will, where policy shifts become extremely difficult and problematic to make, and to really avoid anything new from really happening. And in this last quadrant, high ambiguity, high tension, we've got within Alberta and across the provinces of Ontario, Alberta, New Brunswick, and some degree in Nova Scotia. I can't think of a case where there isn't confusion, ambiguity, contestation around math. Math is seemed to be the new DNA of education reform and discussion across the country, all right? So, lots of background noise when you look at these four quadrants. The question becomes whether or not the claims that are being made around Education 2030, or if we move to a global competency-focused curriculum, that somehow, and this certainly was the case in Alberta, and to a lesser degree in Ontario, more I think in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, depending on when you see different ministers come and go about the ratcheting up of the conversation around competencies. The claim has been made by some that these rhetorical shifts or policy statements are really more or less a mechanism to keep the system where it's at, and really nothing new really happens. And again, we have this question of foreclosing the future, because certainly in Alberta and in other provinces like Ontario, the complementarity between the move to competencies and the privileging of technology and the acquisition of technology in schools has been phenomenal. And I think it's been impossible to separate the two, the conversation around competencies and the acquisitions around technology. None of them, good or bad, they are just a handshake that's been very prevalent. And so the Council of Ministers of Education, as we all know, has been operating very much in the background. When you talk to ministers, both experienced ministers and new ministers and senior officials within different ministries, CMEC continues to play an important role. And it'll be interesting over the next couple of days, and then next week and the weeks following, once whatever is being promoted in advance tomorrow, how it starts to live at CMEC and is then used to roll out policy initiatives across the country. In Ontario, just to drive the point home very quickly, I'll just drill into a few examples in terms of that quadrant, low ambiguity, high ambiguity, and so on. That in the Ontario case, for example, recently, as you all know, with the new government, there was part of a review that started under the previous administration around whether or not we should have major reform in Ontario on the testing programs. And what's interesting is the very different paths that are being advanced in Ontario. 20th century competencies, and however they're defined. Again, we've spent much of the day playing around with the language around what competencies might mean, what they mean in certain environments. And what's interesting in terms of this quote, You can see again the involvement of the business community, nothing new here. But I was really struck from the Ontario document in terms of the high ambiguity of the ways that competencies are being played out in the country. This footnote is worth having some meditation. It begs the question, what is not a competency? Okay. But I think this speaks to the policy prolepsis, the idea that we make an announcement as a ministry and then we try to figure out what it means as it's implemented, okay? And then this is another example from the Ontario document. And I use Ontario only not because 40% of the population of the country lives in Ontario, but Ontario has a very influential role in the space in education policy reform. But when you get down to the teachers and ask them questions around what do they see as the difference between 21st century competencies and the words that are put out, as Sam did nicely this morning, the list of 30 terms and other terms including collaboration, we get claims like this that, well, collaboration means something different today because it involves a mediated space and the use of technology. That's the question that one needs to ask, and it shows that handshake that's necessary between the policy and the technology piece, okay? I found this document very interesting because in Ontario, despite the promise of a review of their provincial testing programs, they basically came up to the conclusion that we can't really change anything in terms of our assessment programs, okay? Although we have this broad conversation around competencies and the competency-focused curriculum, thanks to the OECD, kudos to them. But when push comes to shove, the old question keeps rearing its head. Do we need to continue conventional sample testing, or census testing, sorry, as opposed to moving to census testing and changing some of the nuts and bolts in the machinery of our accountability architectures? And clearly in this report, as they conclude, we're not going to change anything. In fact, as many of you know, in Ontario, with a new government, there's going to be a ratcheting up of more standardized testing. I know in Alberta, where I'm from, there's already been a commitment from the government to bring in testing, possibly every year in different subjects. It's going to be very interesting in that space, okay? The statement at the back, or the bottom there, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts has endorsed the continuation of census assessments. Again, an example of how the Treasury Board in different provinces and territories across the country actually is, in fact, pulling the strings on how we operationalize educational reform. Nothing new, nothing surprising here. Okay. I thought this was really interesting. From the Ontario document, again, I'm using Ontario because it's typical of what you see in other provinces like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Atlantic Canada, the prairies. Sure, we're going to change our assessment policies and practices, and this is the great reform we're going to make. We're going to give students choice, and I've bolded the choice in the EQ-AO assessment on the left side. You'll get 2 reading passages with different topics, and the students can pick. So there you go, right? To quote Monty Python, a nod is as good as a wink to a blind bat, right? And of course, on the right side, the referencing and signaling and gesturing to technology yet again. So again, despite the tendency to say, well, the change in government in Ontario marked a dramatic shift in terms of the political direction and of how OECD PISA and all of its supplements were being picked up, really the bureaucracy was really making the determination at the end of the day, and no real indication that there's going to be a shift in direction. The research, what Ontario used to have, in my humble opinion, is a great, robust research program in education research, leading the country, I would say, in terms of collaboration with the profession. Now we've got the focus on data architectures, and hashtag data in action. I'm not sure if it should be in action or in action, but you can figure that out for yourselves, okay? Nova Scotia, I already mentioned the very problematic decisions made in the past year. I won't spend any more time on that. But it is interesting, as many of you know in the room, going back to the claim made earlier around how policies are taken up and implemented. The data never stands on its own face. It's always picked up and used and appropriated and mobilized in different ways. And again, the decision to pull the administrators or school leaders out of the Nova Scotia Federation. Dr. Glaze is now working with the Manitoba government on a very similar project, and we'll see what plays out there. New Brunswick, again, New Brunswick is interesting because in terms of its performance on PISA, it's been struggling compared to the rest of the Canadian jurisdictions, whatever that means. But there's been a lot of anxiety and angst inside the ministry in New Brunswick around why are we struggling compared to the other Canadian provinces. Yet we see yet again much of the same language being taken up in New Brunswick around equity, which is a great thing, but how it's being framed and taken up, you can see very familiar terminology from CMEC, from Ontario, from other provinces. Everyone at their best, this is the program in New Brunswick. Future ready, no one left behind. It's all variations, right? What's interesting in the bullets there is on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. I love this, a competencies think tank with educators, students, and key partners. And it goes on to explain, really what they're trying to do is populate the words with some meaning that makes some sense in the New Brunswick space. And then, of course, the top right-hand corner, the involvement of the New Brunswick Business Council with, count them, 10 principles, okay? So, there we go, consultation. Alberta, wrap up very quickly here. Our province happily went down the path of a future-ready curriculum, as Minister Egan announced so proudly in 2016. It was going to be a robust program. The second bullet really captures the imaginary of the New Democratic Party when they came to power in 2016. I mean, they were the most surprised people in the room after the election, but they quickly adopted the future-ready agenda from the OECD. As the second bullet points out, we're going to move towards the adoption of policies and pronouncements, including education, skills, and training programs designed to ensure all Albertans can find rewarding work today and tomorrow. And then it goes on to talk about in the third bullet, and this is where the minister and the government got into lots of trouble. Material will be developed, this is on the third bullet, to teach students financial literacy, climate change, the history of Indigenous people, and residential schools, and gender identity. And then, of course, computer coding came in 2 days later when it was asked in a news conference, well, what about computer coding? And so all it went. Now, all of this, of course, is history, as you all know, with the election of the Jason Kenney government. But in the recent and not too distant past business plans, you can see how the OECD agenda is taken up by what was thought to be a social democratic, progressive, left-of-center government. Very much, if you look at the right-hand side, a focus on the education sector as a conveyor belt to deliver us to economic prosperity. And again, what's really interesting in the last part of that quote on the right-hand side is the linkage to teacher competencies. Alberta, and this is one of the reasons why I had some issues with my former organization, Alberta and the ATA embraced practice standards for teachers and school principals and system leaders in the hope that the government would give us the legal control over the issuance of a teaching certificate. So everyone was going to is a teacher, principal, superintendent. Everyone is member of the association and subject to its code of conduct and competency review. Follow me? It was all going to be wondrous and joyous. Well, we developed the standards, we launched them, they're now in play, and then of course we had the election of the new government, the United Conservative Party, and now there's open discussion around the reality that we helped co-create. If you've got practice standards that are distinct for teachers, principals, and superintendents, why are the principals in the same organization as the teachers? Because the College of Superintendents is a college. The principals should have a college, right? And we know from the Ontario experience what that looks like, and you know in BC as well. So we kind of, maybe in some view, to use the frame, we did it to ourselves, but you know, it was an attempt to be preemptive and proactive. And then the last piece is the problematic issue I raised earlier. We are really struggling in Alberta around TRC, Truth and Reconciliation, Indigenous education, and we're into some really interesting problems in terms of the ways that data is being gathered, not only on our own provincial assessments, but with PISA, the Global Competency Framework items. There's been talk, hopefully it'll go away, that there's going to be a disaggregated reporting of the results on the competency items for First Nations students, for Aboriginal students, and there's been real pushback and concern in the province around that. And this is, again, an issue across the country. And it's a very much a colonial conversation or a conversation that raises the question around the issues we heard Maria talk about earlier, and the degree to which in Canada and in Alberta specifically, we have some issues in terms of who's going to collect the data, who's going to use the data, and for what purposes. So I'm going to stop there and just reference something that Sam Seller shared with us a number of years ago in some of his work in Alberta, that we really need to think about not only Education 2030 and competencies, whatever that program is, in terms of the question, the lines of inquiry, who is counting what and for whom. Because again, the matrix I shared with you at the beginning, I think it speaks to the reality that we can't look across the country and say, well, we are clear about what the Global Competency Framework or Education 2030 is all about. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of contestation depending on what is being deployed around it. Either policy statements, which are basically generic, we should move down and support all of these lists like Sam shared this morning, the 30 concepts or constructs, gets us into a lot of ambiguity and a lot of contestation very quickly. And so I'll leave you with these questions. We're not going to address them today, but I think it's part of a larger research program or programs that are out there. The literature is full of this discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity from invitation from BCTF to be here today and to be part of the observer status, if you will, from the Canadian Teachers Federation, because I think we're all watching this bus go around the parking lot and people getting on and off and wondering what's actually going on and who's driving the bus. So thanks for listening, and over to Andre. Okay.